Well, welcome. Thank you so much for all of you joining us today. This is a real opportunity to go backwards in time and then go to where we are today and then look forward. I can tell you that the history to this was actually quite difficult to find. So what I wanted to do was actually put some of that history into the PowerPoint slides that I'm going to present. We've given you a newspaper, especially for the event. I just wanted to quickly walk you through this. So basically it has the history called Revisiting Tomorrow. We've got defining moments. So this is actually looking on the left-hand side is actually some of the publications. And before you, I have all the publications that we have. There's actually still some out there in the wider community, and if we put little asterisks on the back page to indicate the ones we know we don't have copies of. So I'm sorry it's so tiny, but you can appreciate how many publications there was over that time. So there's a little asterisk and there's a little email right at the bottom so you can contact us. So our objective in this is actually collecting that history and also enabling I think sort of a broader and deeper discussion so that this isn't going to go away. Long-term planning, foresight, strategic thinking, all of these terms will drive today and going forward. So this is an opportunity to take a little window with some experts in this area and try and build that into our, embed it into our thinking, be creative and hopefully come up with some really cool ideas. So this is the context that I wanted to give. So I felt that if to do this properly, I needed to give this background, this history, this context, so that we can have hopefully a deeper discussion. So I'm going to refer to the New Zealand at the Turning Point. This report is absolutely fascinating. It was chaired by Frank Holmes and before the Commission for the Future and the New Zealand Planning Council was created. And I'm going to talk about it a little bit through the PowerPoint slides and set the context. And really, I suppose what I realised when I was doing this research is that New Zealand is at another turning point, understanding that what drove the Commission for the Future and the New Zealand Planning Council and the ideas and thinking that was happening over that period of time was because they were actually starting to see the challenges, if you like, the disruptions, the sort of integrated nature of things, but not fully understanding or finding institutions or mechanisms or initiatives to deal with it. So it was incredibly insightful read, highly recommend. But first, I wanted to give you a bit of a futures concept because we actually did some workshops with Simpson Grierson on climate-related financial disclosures, which sounds quite a big mouthful. But to do those disclosures correctly, you actually need to do some scenario work. And so we did some scenario work with a large group of regulators and companies and auditors and had them all in the room doing scenario work. And once again, it just reminded me, number one, how it requires a different way of thinking, and we needed some terminology. So basically, I used the good old cone of plausibility. These are sort of terms that I'm going to just go through relatively quickly, but they're a language that we might want to use later, so that's why I wanted to get them out there. So basically there's three sights: hindsight, insight and foresight. The best way that futurists, it's not really an academic area of study, although some would argue it is, but it is more a problem, a space that people struggle to fill. There's a lot of talk on strategy and there's a lot of expertise, and I would say that is an academic area of study. But foresight, we are still grappling, but we've kind of like the cone of plausibility, if you like, using the futurist background. So three different sites and different types of futures that you can be talking about: probable, possible, and preferred futures. once you start getting into preferred futures, you're starting to delve into strategy, because then you're saying, how do we get from there to there, this point to that point? So just considering, and the concept of possible futures is highly relevant here, because that's really what the Commission for the Future was trying to do. And getting more into the preferred future was where the New Zealand Planning Council was going to go. And I'm going to emphasise that again by looking at some legislation. We started the Institute in 2004. We like to think that all these three areas require focus, and that basically when you have more uncertainty, more disruption, you're better looking at things from a foresight base rather than a strategy base. And that sort of makes sense in that you don't know what's going to happen, so you're kind of you're better looking and observing and thinking and talking about stuff rather than getting into the nitty-gritty detail. So, but actually you need all three. You also need this reporting area, which is what we're talking about. And that's really just, these slides will be available, but these are how I see these three different types of policy tools. And you can't actually do them in one day. They're almost, you need to mentally think that you're in one space. I'm doing foresight here, I might be doing reporting tomorrow, but just understanding, because you seem to lose, if you try and do foresight and then go into strategy, you seem to lose that creativity. And that's what I'm really trying to indicate here, that they are linked, but they are very separate. And in the same thing that we were seeing in 1976, we're also seeing now that we actually want foresight skills and conversations. I'm putting this out here because this was the game in 1978, and so interesting. So this was going through the education system, and I know there's some people from the Ministry of Education here, so thanks. It's great. We actually run workshops with young people, and we challenged a group of young people, I think about 3-4 years ago, to create a set of card games. And this is the cards they created, and they created 4 different games from it. And it's an interesting exercise. And I was talking to people at Z Energy today, and they actually used the cards and said how fantastic it was. You know, it's lovely to get that feedback. And also, I was in Australia at a foresight organisation, and I just got a lovely thank you from the young people at the equivalent to Foreign Affairs, saying how they really loved it. So it's this trying to get into this foresight area without getting into strategy, which is what these games were trying to do. And now I wanted to drill in a little bit about New Zealand context. So this is a very rough timeline. And the reason I'm putting that up here is just to understand, I've been trying to think of a way to illustrate how out there the Commission for the Future was, and even to a degree the New Zealand Planning Council, and how it was really considered as an experiment. And luckily we've got some text to indicate that. So these are all different initiatives over time. Probably on that whole list, the closest to the Commission for the Future would be the Climate Change Commission that will come out. And I wanted to point out that that's largely a non-partisan initiative, and the Commission for the Future had a non-partisan element in that it had MPs, or a minister and an MP from the opposite side of the House. So that was, at that case was Labour, and so that was really interesting to me, that they were trying to create a safe place. So the more you dig into this, the more you understand actually how clever they were, how hard they were thinking. So what I wanted to do was take you through, this is the New Zealand at the Turning Point book. This on the right-hand side is really interesting because in 1970, they had the National Development Council, and they set out targets and assumptions, and these were, if you like, on this 1 to 13 was the things that they thought were important to watch and look for. And you can see their assumptions and targets in that first column, and then you can see the outcome. So what this book is saying is that basically they knew at that time that the institutions and mechanisms that they had put in place were not delivering what they wanted. It's like, this is spinning out of control. What's happening? And I'm going to go back to that in a little moment. But I really like this bit about there is continual appraisal of the extent to which what needs to happen, to which the objectives of planning are being achieved, and if they are not, whether it is the objectives or the policies and programs which need to be altered. I wanted to just emphasise there for a moment that they're using the word planning where we probably would be using the word strategy today. So if you can kind of imagine that planning had a broader connotation than what we would use. So when you're looking back and reading this material, they've got the New Zealand Planning Act. What they were trying to say was it was actually, a much bigger initiative and level of thinking that they were trying to pursue. So these are just some quotes that I thought was really relevant for when you look at this experiment that I'm putting out there. So they say New Zealand does not at present have appropriate techniques and institutions to carry out long-term appraisal of trends, issues and options. Amazing, written in 1976, the second middle paragraph. And I thought this was really interesting, where they're saying, to the extent the issues confronting governments and individual citizens are likely to become more rather than less complex, a serious planning effort is worth trying. So they were kind of like turning around and saying, we don't know, let's just try something because the status quo is not working. And what could that look like? And so so in this book, they, were looking to put forward those options. And Jim Bolger might like to talk a little bit more about that. I'm going to leave it open for you. And then the last bit, which I've already talked about, was they really wanted a bipartisan approach, which is fantastic, wasn't it? So much, our 3-year election cycle makes it very, very difficult to get that long-term thinking. And, we're unusual in the world for our 3-year cycle. So I just thought that I wanted to raise that as well to set that context. So what were they trying out using the term that they used? So they created a 2-tier approach, long-term explorative, 30 years, and a short-term planning, 10 years, being the Commission for the Future in the New Zealand Planning Council. They wanted to integrate economic, social, and environmental factors. So interesting, this task force was called on economic and social planning. So actually understanding that was really new and innovative globally. So, that actually these issues couldn't be looked in isolation. The other aspects was integrating central and local planning. They talk a lot about that. Adopting a non-partisan approach, which I've talked about, and they were looking at highly consultative. So they were looking at public rather than parliament focus. So they wanted an informed society. Democracy was really important for them. They were wanting to engage. So there was a real desire to be working with people, building knowledge in society so good decisions could be made, rather than necessarily focus on MPs, although there is that aspect as well. So what I want you to do now, and I'm sorry to do this to you, but I think it's actually really valid, because when I was doing this work, I realised I wanted to illustrate how unusual the Commission of the Future was. And I thought the best way to do that was to look at some initiatives over time. So I'm going to do this quite quickly. There's, I think, 7 of them. And I'm referring to the legislation. And if you do have a moment and you are interested in this, we will put the slides up and you can actually drill in and understand the legislation that was formed around developing, I suppose, long-term thinking in New Zealand. So this is the Commission for the Future. You can see it's all about possibilities. So that's looking at possible futures. It goes back to that cone of plausibility that we talked about. So I'm going to go through them quick, so you don't need to read them, just need to be aware of them. Also in the Planning Act was the New Zealand Planning Council, and you can see if you read that, they've got the integration, they've got right down the bottom medium-term consultative planning, so you can kind of get a bit of a flavour of what they were trying to do. And they saw these as being integrated, like different rooms but in the same building, if you can, so to speak. So they were looking at that narrative. When the when the Commission for the Future was disestablished, the Planning Council continued on, and that's actually, the legislation for that is actually in the back of the newspaper. The thinking behind that was, so they actually changed the legislation to put more responsibility on the New Zealand Planning Council, which might be talked about by Peter. Now, this is where I'm going to go really fast because I know you want time with the speakers, but I wanted you to be aware that these slides are here. So this is the start of the PCE. So this is looking in 1986, but still not actually very progressive in terms of long-term thinking. I hate to say it, I know there's people here from PCE, but it's not talking about the length of the long term. It's not looking very integrated in a way. Crown Research Institutes, which were sort of seen as, when the New Zealand Planning Council was disestablished, that was going to be, if you like, the White Hope, a new way of like looking at a new mechanism, and you can look into the legislation on that, and once again it's pretty narrow. Productivity Commission, and I know there's people from the Productivity Commission here, I think. Well, it was pretty light, actually. I was expecting a lot more. I think that they've done a fantastic job with what the legislation has given them, but it's not actually, it's not as much as I expected to find there. This is looking at the Infrastructure Commission, which started this year. Once again, you could take from it infrastructure is a long-term business, but once again, not very strong. And then lastly, looking at the Climate Change Commission. Now, this is the one that has the most comparability to the Commission for the Future in the term that they're looking long term. Like if you look at any of the IPC scenarios, you're looking at 100 years, and also that climate change emissions, that's going to affect everything. So you can actually get a sort of a general sense of the challenge that the Commission for the Future will have. So if you illustrated this, and I was going to do a scatter graph, but I didn't think that was it didn't work for me, so I did it this way. So these are all the initiatives in the little boxes down the bottom, and this is looking at the level of long-term focus, which is in the blue, and the orange is looking at the level of integration. And what I did was I went through those pieces of legislation and I took a bit of a stab at what I sort of saw from in the legislation. And basically it sort of says that the Commission for the Future was quite an extreme from the National Development Council, which is really hard to find anything on. I really struggled with that. But the Commission for the Future, you can see it's basically almost a 5 out of 5 scenario there. Planning Council, of course, was shorter term, but still integrated. Then you've got a bit of a trough there happening, and then the Climate Commission is kind of coming up again and going into an area. So what that says to me almost is, my gosh, we're going to have to look after the Climate Commission because it's entering a space that has not been positive for people in the past, and I thought that might be an interesting area for us to drill into if we want to. I'm just going to really quickly go through change. So this is looking at some work we did in 2011 by going back through the old yearbooks to understand the level of change that was happening. But what I did want you to look at was 1975. If you take the 1975 row across, you can see the level of change that's happening to New Zealand at that period of time. So it really was New Zealand at the turning point. So I thought that just might be useful in terms of the context we're used to. We've already had to deal with massive transition, and we've got another one coming up. This is just a little teaser, and this was kind of looking at the 1970s, what sort of transition was happening in the 1970s, and this is actually, you can just have a little slip through your eyes over that one. That's first colour TV, which is very exciting, and a few other. The first Fred Dagg came on the scene, just a few little other teasers, but this is the more heavy stuff there. But just understanding it really was a time of major change. And then in the 2020s, we've got the, and I put 2020's question mark because of course we're not there yet, but just understanding these issues. And it's a very interesting exercise we did this morning with the team, is to say, well, what are the patterns that you're seeing between this? And when you look at the lists, it's quite interesting. I'm not going to tell you the answers we got to. You might want to ask, but it's very interesting to understand what are the common characteristics between one column versus the other column. And I'll leave you to have a look or think about that later. Hugh Templeton isn't with us, but he may pop in. We'll just see. So this is a video that we did, and I actually phoned him again to confirm that I could share this with you. And he's also given us quite a few notes and details. But I thought it was interesting. He says, I will read it out to you. I did not put the time that I should have into trying to oversee and nurture the Planning Council and certainly the Commission for the Future. I basically blame myself for the Commission for the Future going off the rails on the security issue and inducing Muldoon to dump it, in his words. And he was really interesting. It's on a YouTube video, McGuinness Institute, if you're interested in getting in more detail. But it was just interesting to understand it, and he put some context around that. You're really busy as an MP, you've got all this stuff happening, you're in Cabinet, lots of things, and sometimes things don't, you forget or you don't follow up on something. So I thought that I wanted to share that with you because I thought it showed his honesty and his reflections of that time. Global context. These are 4 slides, 3 issues. Once again, things that are really useful for me when I think about climate change and the issues facing us. I've got probably about 5 or 6 of them, but these are the 3 that I thinkers that I think have shaped me and the work program and the team at the Institute. So, first one, 1958. Which I might actually tell you was the year I was born. Isn't it terrible? But we just share that with you. Very important year, of course. Now, this is a guy called Warren Weaver. Now, he was Rockefeller, and he was head of science, and he had been spending probably the last 30 years working out where the money from the Rockefeller Foundation went to the science community. And I was just stunned with this guy's thinking. He basically looked at all the science they had invested in, and he went further back. And so he was the guy that came up with this concept of there's problems of simplicity, 2 variable problems. You can have a look at this on your slides later, but basically you're saying everything before 1900 was all the easy science. That was if you do this happens. You get and it was easy, and it was exciting, and you could be incredibly productive and very quickly. And then he was saying, well, since 1900, we've actually been doing all statistics and probability. We've done all the easy stuff before 1900. Then we've done the second lot of easy stuff, which is this concept of numerous random variables. And he uses that wonderful example of the billiard table, and I just love that. And you can kind of see that playing out. And what he says in 1958 is, but we've got this stuff in the middle. How do we deal with these things? Many integrated variables. How does that play out? And he says they are all problems which involve dealing simultaneously with a sizable number of factors which are interrelated into an organic whole. Sounds like climate change, doesn't it? Incredibly interesting. So I always think, that organised complexity is what, if you like, Commission for the Future or the Climate Change Commission, that's why it's so tough. We shouldn't beat ourselves up about that. We should, just look it in the eye, because this is the hard stuff. It's a bit like, someone's gone and done all the easy stuff and they've left us with the hard stuff. And that's the reality of the challenge that we have. I just wanted to acknowledge this report, because I didn't know about this Global 2000 report that was prepared for President Carter. George Preedy's here, which is fantastic, thank you very much, who wrote this piece of work. And I think that's the thing, is if the Commission for the Future hadn't been there, I wouldn't have seen this work, and it has definitely inspired our work program, because I've realised the level of the problem that we have with climate change. It is like if you were to design a problem that society would destroy us, you have designed it in climate change. It has characteristics and hooks and problems for us to solve that is incredibly challenging for scientists, for political leaders. And this is the graph that really did me in. So this was written in 1980, and this is the bit of text that they wrote. So what they were doing was they said, you can see the little today there, 1975, along the bottom. And they were saying, right, if this carbon's going to go in the environment, these are the scenarios, this is how it will play out. You've got to think this is 40 years ago. And they tried to develop some scenarios, even then, of ways to reduce the amount of carbon. It's terrible, isn't it? And then you go to along that chart, so 1975, and you come along to today, it's sort of 2020, and you do your little line up. And of course, you're hitting above 400 on the left-hand side, and you can see roughly where we end up. So, we could say, well, that was really impressive. They did very good on their projections. But it actually really understands that 40 years, we have not been able to change this. So there's something really systemically wrong in the processes and institutions that we have. This is the other one I really liked, or really hit me. So I'm a great follower of this guy, Andrew Haldane. He's kind of like Bank of England chief economist, and he does fantastic speeches. But this one is called Growing Fast and Slow Speech. It's based on Daniel Kahneman's kind of concept of fast and slow. It's quite long, so I just warn you of that, but it is completely fascinating to me, because I couldn't believe that chief economist at the Bank of England would be raising this issue of which came first, sociological or technological change. I mean, how could that be? And yet we put so much focus on technological. We try and solve climate change technologically. So he's not saying, he's not sure, and that surprised me as well. But I just wanted to share that with you, because that makes me think when we're doing our work on scenarios or other work that we're doing, I'm always trying to remind myself to pull in the sociological. What does that mean? How do we make that, is that why we have been 40 years without solving the climate change issue? And I really wanted to compliment, I think, all our political parties in New Zealand that have gone in behind the climate change, zero carbon bill, to make it non-partisan. I mean, that is world-breaking. That is amazing. And all our MPs are just applaud. I think that's an amazing step forward for us. So I think, without further ado, I will pass over to Jim Bolger. Is that all right? Thank you very much.